Okay, so welcome everybody to the Committee for Infrastructure today. I just want to provide a brief overview of today's business. So the committee will consider oral evidence from the Department for Infrastructure on the better use of public and community sector funds for the delivery of bus transport in Northern Ireland, implementation of recommendations. We're going to consider written evidence from the Department for Infrastructure on its contribution to the programme for government, and consider 2 statutory rules and 4 proposals for statutory rules not subject to assembly procedure. We're very welcome to have Ben Macaulay, who's sitting in the gallery today. He's on work experience with Stephen Dunn and he's from the University of Ulster. Very welcome to our committee. But just for those in the public gallery, mobile phones can be connected through a Wi-Fi connection. All devices should be muted. 3G, 4G and 5G should not be used, and no recordings or photographs are to be taken. So members are content, we'll proceed through the agenda as follows. I don't think I have any apologies today. We have Nicola and Mark who are joining us online. Declarations of interest, or remind members that they are obliged to declare any relevant financial or other interests which might reasonably be thought by others to influence their approach to the matter under consideration. Any members who have interest to declare in relation to today's business should do so now when the particular matter arises in the meeting. Does any member have any interest to declare? No? Okay. There's no chairperson's business today. Item 4 is the draft minutes. At page 7 you'll see draft minutes of the proceeding of the meeting on the 2nd of April 2025. So I'm just seeking agreement that members are content that the minutes are a true and accurate reflection of the meeting on the 2nd of April 2025. If so, I'll sign the minutes now. You content?
Great.
Thank you. Okay, item 5 is matters arising. Does any member have any matters arising from the previous meeting? No? Okay. Item 6 is correspondence. At page 19 you'll see the correspondence memo. At page 25 you'll see an invitation from the department to the 7 foundations for the future stakeholder engagement conferences aimed at enhancing infrastructure development and public welfare. So due to the scheduling of the majority of the events, I have to say it is quite disappointing that they do happen whenever the infrastructure committee meeting is taking place. So our members content. Obviously last week what we decided to do was seek an update on the stakeholders in attendance at the event and seek an overview of the key themes and proposed solutions that were raised at that meeting. So I'm seeking that maybe we do that just for the rest of those sessions, but I think it might be worthwhile just reiterating our disappointment that, you know, the committee won't be able to engage in this forum in the way that we would perhaps maybe have liked. Are you content with that? Or any comments to be made on that? No? Content? Okay. Page 41 is response to the committee from the Minister of Finance. It's correspondence regarding the Motor Insurance Task Force. So I think it's important that we do seek an update from the Department of Finance requesting the outcome of the discussion with the Motor Insurance Task Force. Obviously it's a big issue and I've noted obviously, you know, the meeting hasn't really taken place as yet. So are you content with that approach? Okay, thank you. At page 134, response from the Consumer Council to the committee request for an annual accessibility reports for Northern Ireland airports. So you'll obviously remember that the committee previously engaged with the Consumer Council following the experiences of Andy Allen MLA regarding the travel disruption that he experienced at Birmingham Airport. The committee was keen to satisfy itself that similar occurrences were not happening across the airports locally, and we have been engaging with the Consumer Council for Northern Ireland who undertake annual disability audits. These audits normally commence at the end of the year and are published once complete. The most recent reports on Belfast International, Belfast City and the City of Derry airports are included in the members' pack for your information. So are you content that we note the reports and that we write to Andy Allen highlighting the current findings of the report for his information as well, because I know it's something that he is very passionate and very keen about as well, and it's obviously was related to his experiences at Birmingham Airport.
Chair, and also stipulate, keep us posted. If he feel, he needs to contact the committee again, or if there's any other issues to raise, feel free to do so,
Okay, thank you. Okay, moving on, at page 185, there's an invitation from Belfast City Airport to visit and meet the staff and tour the facilities. So are you content that the clerk engages informally with them to establish detail of the proposed areas of discussion, and obviously just make sure that there's linkage to the committee's role and functions for consideration at a later date? Are you content with that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, at page 4 of the tabled pack, you'll see correspondence from the Minister of Infrastructure in response to the committee's request on the review of arm's length bodies. So I'm just seeking agreement that we forward this response to the Committee for Finance for their information. You content?
Yep.
At page 5 of the table pack as well, you'll see correspondence from the Committee for the Executive Office on the Strategy for Ending Violence Against Women and Girls. So I'm seeking agreement that we just write to the department just to establish what role it has in delivering the strategy, if any, and to establish what funding has been bid for or earmarked to support its delivery. We might already know the committee's or the department's role, but it's just useful to get that just in writing from themselves as well, if you're content.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so just seeking agreement that you're all content to note the remaining correspondences contained in the correspondence memo in the meeting pack, table pack. Okay, content, thank you. Okay, we're now moving on to our oral evidence session. So item 7, and this is the better use of public and community sector funds for the delivery of bus transport in Northern Ireland, implementation of recommendations, Department for Infrastructure, oral evidence. So you'll see at page 187 is the clerk's memo. At page 191, you'll see Department for Infrastructure, better use of public and community sector funds for the delivery of bus transport in Northern Ireland, written evidence. So we welcome to the committee today Peter Rice, Director of Public Transport Operations, Leona Lees, Project Manager of the Community Transport Phase 2 Review, and John Covell, Community Transport Review Team. You're very welcome to the committee today. We look forward to hearing from you. And as you know, this is an important issue, particularly the community transport sector as well. We all know the benefit of it within our own local constituencies. So, members, I'm just seeking agreement that the evidence is recorded by Hansard, if you're all agreed. Okay, thank you. So I know that you have a PowerPoint presentation for the committee today. We obviously have written evidence as well that's been provided to the committee. So if you don't mind briefly, for 5 to 10 minutes going through your PowerPoint presentation, and then I'll come to members' questions. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, committee, and thanks for the invite and the opportunity to talk about community transport. So I've got a few slides. I'll just go through fairly quickly. I suppose, further to the committee's request, you were looking into the report back in 2013, 12 years ago. A lot of things have changed since then. So just to recap, back in 2013, the department responded to the committee. I think we sent a copy of that. Since then, at the time of the report, the department was leading in a pilot project between 2012 and 2015 to look at how our integrated transport could be taken forward in a practical way, looking at community transport, education, health and TransLink. That pilot concluded in 2015. There was a project appraisal, an evaluation report, and out of that led to a further project which looked to try and take some of the lessons from the pilot project and scale it up into a wider project across the province. That was called the Integrated Public Transport Project, and the department was in the lead for that. That was a very challenging project to take forward, multiple stakeholders with multiple views. It was also at a time of particular challenge around the establishment of the Education Authority, the reform of the civil service, including the departments, and as well as some of the political challenges at the time. Coming out of that, there was a project appraisal, which identified a lot of those challenges and how that project was progressing. The outcome of that project appraisal really was to pause the work. That project had two strands, looking at community transport and health, working closely together, and also education and TransLink. However, the challenges faced at that time, it was deemed unfeasible to take that project forward as currently envisaged. And I suppose that's where it got to. And then time has moved on and we're into the current environment. So if I can then committee be fully aware of what the transport sector looks like at the minute. So you've got those projects, those public transport funded by the department, primarily TransLink through Metro, Glider and Ulsterbus, and then under the community transport side, which is Dela Lift, Disability Action Transport Scheme. And then outside of the department, you've got the community transport funded by other organisations. You've obviously got the health sector and the education sector. In terms of TransLink, so since the report back in 2013, there have been a number of changes within the relationship between the department and TransLink. So we have the partnership agreement, which was signed last year, which sets out the governance arrangements between the department and TransLink, roles and responsibilities. And then we also have the public service agreement, which is a 5-year contract between the department and TransLink, and it sets out the services that are to be delivered by TransLink and the levels of performance that they should adhere to. At the minute, as part of that governance arrangements, the department and TransLink are taking forward a review of Ulsterbus services, and primarily that's looking at how those services can be delivered more effectively and efficiently. And that needs to take account of the services provided through TransLink for the Education Authority, for the school transport. On the other side of that, there's the community transport review, and Leona and John are taking it forward on behalf of the department. But community transport is there to try and address the gap between, not met by TransLink and the other private sector. Going back to the original committee report, the arrangements for community transport have probably remained very unchanged since 2013. And that's one of the reasons why we're keen to bring forward that review. Funding for this year is in the region of about 5.4 million for the two streams of community transport. And those funding streams really under, again, this slide just showing you how that's done. So you've got for the Disability Action Transport Scheme, it's funded under the Transport Programme for People with Disabilities. And then the Rail Transport Fund, that primarily funds the Dela Lift. And that's also supported by DAERA through the Assisted Rural Transport Scheme. So the Community Transport Review, the overall aims are to consider how community transport vision for the longer term to ensure that the department is maximising both the value for money and outcomes through the investment in those areas, and how the role of community transport complies in delivery of public transport. It is focused primarily on what the department funds and not the other streams funded by other departments. Phase 1 of the review, and I think we've shared a copy of that report with the committee, did a lot of the groundwork in terms of trying to understand the existing arrangements within the community transport sector, the views of the users, views of the providers, and views of other stakeholders. So that information has been gathered, as I shared with the committee earlier this year. The next part of the review, Phase 2, has recently commenced. As I mentioned, Leon and John will be taking that forward, and it's trying to build on the Phase 1 report. So really it's looking at an analysis of the financial information and performance of the community transport sector, and really with the intention to try and identify better and more important, key metrics in terms of the financial performance of the community transport sector and the delivery of those services. That's one of the key strands coming out of that review. The next is really the service delivery model. What are the potential service delivery models that could be provided? We have the existing arrangement that's been in place since 2013. Are there other service delivery models that could be provided? And that's been looking across the wider spectrum. And then on the outcome of that, really from the first point and the second point, is looking at what are a potential service delivery model going forward and how would that be funded. So that's where we are in terms of the community transport review. That work has initially commenced. We've started engagement with the various stakeholders and community, including the Community Transport Association, and that engagement will continue over the spring and summer. The intention, and it is quite a big challenge, is to complete that review for the autumn. In parallel with the Department's review of community transport, we're trying to reinvigorate the working group for the cross-departmental, and that is with ourselves, Department for Agriculture, and also with the Department of Health. And really, that is trying to engage with those other departments to try and understand where community transport can help them in their provision of their activities. That actually is a meeting of that cross-departmental working today, so other colleagues who would have been here are actually at that instead. So that's me, Chair, and a run through of the...
Super, that's great, thank you very much. As I say, community transport is really, really important, and as MLAs we have seen in the past quite a strong lobby in relation to the funding from constituents, and I see the benefit of it in my own constituency of Fermanagh and South Tyrone, which is a very rural constituency. I just wanted to kick off by asking, Phase 1 was supposed to be completed about 12 to 18 months ago. Why was there a delay, I suppose, in Phase 1? And you said there, you know, March to October is quite, I suppose, not quoting you, but a challenging type of time frame. So do you expect there to be a run-on in relation to the Phase 2 aspect of it as well?
We hope not. It is challenging. And as you've mentioned, there are multiple stakeholders and multiple views and interest in this important area. So I think part of the challenge for the Phase 1 review is making sure that they engaged with that full range of stakeholders in order to capture that information and their views. That took longer than anticipated, but I wasn't personally involved in it, but I understand that was one of the key reasons for it. In looking ahead, we recognise that the time frame is challenging, but to try and reassure ourselves and the committee that we've looked at a project plan, put together a sort of a PID to try and understand what are the key activities we need to do between now and the autumn, and to try and plan that out in a realistic manner to give ourselves the real opportunity of coming back in the autumn with the completion of the Phase 2 report. So that's our intentions.
So the delay then in the Phase 1 was really down to the stakeholder engagement and the length of time that it took? Okay. In terms of the review, do you believe that you will be able to implement the findings of the review in full, given the budget context as well? No, Chair. So the review, when it reports, will identify, will look at potential different service delivery models and make a recommendation on what a future service delivery model might look like. The implementation of that then will be, the Minister will need to consider that review, need to consider the report, and then decide if we are implementing that there, then we would come back with an implementation plan as to how that would occur. Depending on the service delivery model identified, there might be need for additional funding, it might be need for less funding, it might be reconfigured in different ways, but that will be subject to the outcome of the review and the analysis and information we receive. I would hope that it wouldn't be less funding given the tight financial constraints that some of the community transport find themselves already in. I know in my own local constituency there's about 1,000 people who have been turned away from journeys, so I would like to hope that hopefully the funding models will show, and that brings me on to my next point. In terms of that cross-departmental working group, obviously DFI, Department of Health, DERA sit on that. Do you not think there's a role and a need that community transport need to be at the table in that cross-departmental working group as well? I think at this stage it does what it says in the tin, it's cross-departmental, yes, rather than bringing in other stakeholders. I think there's an opportunity, because the working group hasn't met in a while, that there's an opportunity to reconfigure that there, to re-energise it. My view, without talking to colleagues in health and DEAR, would be that we probably wanted to keep it on cross-departmental basis,
we as a department probably work very closely with with the community transport sector, and would understand what maybe they could provide. But anything coming out of that cross-departmental working group, we will definitely share with the community transport sector. And one of the, I suppose maybe not lessons, but one of the things we'd valued from the first part of the review was the need to have close engagement with the community transport sector. So that's something we're trying to make sure we bed into the phase 2 review. And obviously that can then lead across into input into the cross-departmental working group, if that makes sense.
Okay. Another aspect, obviously, contained within the phase 1 report is obviously figures about, the journeys and what they relate to, for example, health, etc. And as we know, with health transformation, it's important that people are getting to their appointments. Community transport play a huge role in relation to that, particularly in the likes of rural areas. So is that going to be part of looking at that fund, taking that data forward now in this phase 2 to look at, do other departments need to step up in relation to the funding that they provide to community transport to enable, more journeys in that particular area?
I'll bring Leonie in only a second.
Yep.
I think the phase 2 review will want to look at service delivery models and look at what's done elsewhere, and I suppose how effective or otherwise that is, and then how do we try and translate that to ourselves. It is primarily focused on the funding that we as DFI provide to community transport. One of the I think issues from previous work back in 2013 to 2018 was the significant challenges of trying to do an awful lot with multiple stakeholders, and one of the recommendations coming out of that project appraisal was to look at it more in individual pilots and individual projects, so to try and take it in slightly smaller chunks, if I can put it that way, in order to try and make improvements. So that's part of the approach we're adapting for the community transport review. There's no doubt in our cross-departmental working group we will want to understand how community transport can help health, as you mentioned there, Chair, and what that might look like. There's significant expenditure by health on public transport to their services. So if there's a way in which community transport can help address that there, we would want to hear that there from colleagues in health, and then how we can maybe build that into potential service delivery model going forward. Is there anything you'd want to add to that, Leona?
Well, I suppose what I have spoken to recently with a group of the stakeholders about, and what we want to do in phase 2 initially, is establish quite clearly what the fundamental cost of delivering a trip is, and a service that's doing that, so that when it comes to answering a question like you've just asked in terms of providing additional journeys for health reasons or for whatever, we have a clear understanding of how much that would cost, and if we have to ask another department to part fund us for that or to provide funding for that, we know what we're asking for. At the minute it would be difficult to say we need X amount of funding to support us delivering these trips for the health sector or for whatever sector that might be. So the first thing we really want to establish from the phase 2 is how much should it cost to deliver these additional services, if that's what we want to do. How much does it cost to deliver them now, so that we know what the ask is if we're going to scale it up or expand the services or change the services in any way. We know what we need to ask, and I think yourself, we were at the CTA event recently here, and that was the thing that was sort of obvious to me, was the need, but the thing that wasn't obvious to me is like, well, there's all this unmet need, how much would it cost to meet that need? And that's always going to be the problem when funding is tight, is how much does it cost. So that's what we really want to get a good handle on in the first stages of phase 2, to be able to then move that on into looking at the service delivery models and the funding options, is to understand what it is we're going to be asking for.
And I suppose that'll differ over different areas as well, too.
It'll be very, it's not like a unique cost per trip for the whole of Northern Ireland. There'll be different factors that will affect different areas differently. So it's understanding in a particular area what it should cost to deliver the services that they want to deliver, and what the ask then is for that. Because at the minute we sort of know globally how much all of these things cost, but we don't understand what's in behind that, to know where the savings can be made or where the efficiencies can be made, that allows more money to go into the delivery of services, and where the synergies are from joining services together and such like. So that's the fundamental building block we want to get initially established.
So then the committee in future sessions will be looking at the regional transport strategy, and I just wanted to see how community transport fits in with that planning, because obviously they provide a public service in terms of transport as well. Do you feel that it is included within that?
Obviously, the regional transport strategy is taken forward by other colleagues within the department. I know they have been engaged with a range of stakeholders across the region, and they're taking that forward in different geographical locations to represent the transport plans. My understanding is that community transport may have been engaged as part of the process, but I'm not sure, Chair. So if that's something I can take away and come back to you on.
Yeah, just to check that up. We will be, as a committee, looking at it, in future, but if you can provide us with that information, that would be great, because I feel when we're looking at transport as a whole, it may be beneficial to have community transport as part of that, given the nature of the journeys and what they are doing, as I said before, in rural areas, which is important. I also just wanted to check up, obviously there was a pilot programme. I think Dungannon was one of the areas in which that pilot programme happened in, and obviously you have the review of Ulster bus services, and you've obviously the community transport review happening as well. Will there be a matching up of what happens there, given the findings of what came out of the pilot programme? I do think that there is a need to look at how community transport can fill some of the gaps in rural areas for public transport. And to me, it just seems that there seems to be a bit of friction or something there in the system, where getting the right people in the room at the one time to actually come up with an agreement of what will actually happen, seems to be a bit of an issue. Is that your understanding of it? Because I'm looking at my area where you have no bus transportation, maybe one bus a day, and it's bringing school kids from a rural area in. That's not helpful for people who need to get to jobs and that type of thing, so...
It's extremely challenging and complex, providing public transport in urban and rural areas to meet all of those needs, and it's fair to say probably unable to meet all of those needs, given the dispersed nature of the population across the region. I think maybe, Chair, if we go back to the pilot back in Dungannon, and that's let's go back a number of years, and they did that appraisal, but that recognised some of those very significant challenges, where you're trying to ensure that you have multiple stakeholders lined up to the same vision, and then you've got a lot of the practical issues of trying to, if you're moving services across, you've got different service delivery models, you've got different staff and different paying conditions, you've got different funding streams. So when that appraisal was done, the recommendation from that was the way that was structured and trying to bring that integrated together, while very noble and well-meaning, that the way that was being brought forward wasn't feasible, and it wasn't deemed to be feasible that it would have a realistic opportunity of actually making a difference or being able to be delivered. So when we're looking at the reviews at the minute, there is an element of, can we focus in on the community transport side, and we'll also look at public transport through Ulster Bus. I think the service delivery model for the community transport has that opportunity of looking elsewhere and saying, actually, there is a different way of delivering those services. Don't want to prejudge what that review looks like, but it might come up with a different model that we have today that might be able to, if we're able to deliver better services, more cost-effective services, that you might be able to roll out wider community transport services to cater for some of that need. It's probably unlikely ever to cater for all the need, to say, because of the dispersed nature of our population. But I think that service delivery model is our opportunity of trying to explore that there and expose what may be possible going forward.
Okay, I'm going to move to other members. Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, folks, for coming along today and for the answers so far. I think the Chair's covered, firstly, the great value that we all place in community transport. It offers a service that's neither logistically or commercially viable that any other provider could provide to go to places that no one else realistically would do, and it does it for a fraction of the cost. And to that end, I think it is another obvious example of investing to save, I suppose, in that respect, where they do things a lot cheaper than either a department or a commercial entity could do. Sadly, what we've seen, certainly in my patch, and you'll have seen it elsewhere, is that because they've been running to standstill for so long financially and logistically, some have gone under and haven't been able to survive. And I'm just wanting to get your assessment, first and foremost, of how vulnerable the community transport sector is, and how many of them are holding on for dear life, hoping for a change in the funding model or for additional services that might become available through transformation of care. Because if we do lose them, what we've seen across the country is they're very hard to bring back because they're reliant on dedicated volunteers, as you know.
I think we're very aware of the financial challenges, not across the public, just the person, but also in community transport. And the sector have made representations to officials and to previous minister and to current minister to highlight those issues and those concerns. Previous Minister O'Dowd was able to increase the funding in year to alleviate some of those pressures. It wasn't able to alleviate all of those pressures, and I think we recognised that at the time. But in a constrained financial environment, the minister highlighted the importance of community transport and sought to allocate additional funding in year to try and address some of those concerns. Obviously, Minister Kim is currently considering the draft budget for next year, and that will reflect the pressures across the wider department, including community transport. So again, we as officials have made the Minister aware of what those pressures are and the scale of the financial pressures and the challenges faced by community transport. Obviously, the Minister will need to take that into consideration along with all the other pressures across the department. But I suppose as officials, we are fully aware of the pressure that community transport is under. We're fully aware of the benefits of community transport and the services that they're delivering. And obviously, we want to support them as much as possible within the constraints of the financial environment. The other aspect of the community transport review is the hope that if we were able to bring forward a different service delivery model, there might be a better way of being able to fund the service, but also maybe to drive out some efficiencies or so that we can deliver more for the amount of money we're going to invest in community transport. But again, that's subject to looking at the review and going through that analysis. Sorry, Leon, is there anything else you want to add to that?
I think the other point that the community transport organisations have raised with us, and it's not something that's new to the committee or to any of us in the public sector, is the difficulty of single year budgets, and that is probably the thing that you're alluding to there, is putting the most pressure on, not knowing, because of the way they're set up as charities and such on, not knowing from year to year. It puts a lot of pressure on them and a lot of uncertainty on them, but that's outside of our gift to do something about. But I know it's in the news all the time about multi-year budgets and the rest of it, so that we're aware of that, and we try as best we can as officials to provide them as much certainty as we have. What we know, they know, and that's the kind of approach we're trying to very much take with them going forward. But we're certainly aware of the challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all waxed lyrical on the problems of multi-year budgets, and I find it remarkable that any charity or voluntary organisation is able to survive on that cliff edge funding year on year. I suppose the point I was trying to make is that we are in danger of losing these fantastic assets at a time when we're looking at a review that might increase the need for them, if you understand what I'm saying. And yet the ones that have gone are very difficult to rekindle because volunteers move on. They find other ways to serve community. So at a time when we're looking at transformation of your care and integrating the community transport with the health provision, or the time when we're reviewing public transport and trying to integrate the rural section with public transport, we may well see situations where the groups that we need down the line have gone. And that's my big fear. And I sense it's a fear of the officials, but how we plug that gap and ensure that we keep these vital assets in place. And I just fear from what you're saying that the funding isn't going to be adequate. So do you have an assessment about, let's say, how many of these groups are very vulnerable and where those gaps currently exist in terms of that provision?
The there are multiple providers of the community transport service across the region, and they all have different pressures, and they've all have different scale of ask in terms of funding. I don't have it in front of me, but I don't think there's a common thread across all of them, as in they all need an X percentage higher. It depends on where they are, and some of them have made it clear to us and our team they are in financial straits, and some of them, you members will be aware, have actually curtailed the services they're delivering to match the funding that's been provided. So there's not a one answer fits all organisations. I can just sort of reassure the committee that as officials we are collecting that information and we are highlighting to the Minister what the industry needs as they deemed it in order to deliver those services that they would like to deliver.
Okay, that's useful. No, two small points finally, Chair, if I may. The first one is the Chair covered this to a degree around how TransLink would maybe look to integrate. How is that currently or going down the line going to be looked at? Who's overseeing? Is that it? Would that be TransLink heading that up with community transport, or would that be yourselves, or would there be? I'm just trying to get a flavour for how community transport could assist into those areas and link up with TransLink in terms of the provision that may or not be there at the minute.
I think that might be one of the areas. As part of the review for community transport, we'll want to look at the service delivery model and what that might look like. There isn't an ask of TransLink working with community transport today to say, okay, you deliver X and we deliver Y. TransLink is delivering the services that we have contracted them to through the PSA. That might change in the future, either through funding arrangements that TransLink make changes to that service delivery in agreement with the department, or it might be as a result of the transport plans the Chair referred to earlier on, that in the future we envisage a public transport service that is slightly different from what we have today in those different regions. Sorry, going back to your question. So in that context, we would look at the service delivery model for community transport to see how they could deliver services within the current TransLink public schedule service. If that makes sense.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, that does make sense. I mean, I know that it exists in some places, but I've taken my patch, for example, in the rural East Antrim point, there are some people that are able to avail of community transport where it comes and picks them up their house, takes them to the park and ride, they go into Belfast, and that system works well, and it wouldn't seem like beyond the wit of us all to try and solve that problem and to try and support it more, to develop that and to get more people on the public transport, but sadly, just for too many people, particularly elderly people, they're not able to avail of that service. So if that was, in a way, you'd be able to integrate an integrated model, I think it would work really well. I'm just trying to get my head around how it's being looked at.
There's no reason why that can't happen as of today.
Yeah,
so there's and
funding.
Well, yes, I'm going to say the constraint isn't anything to do from a policy perspective. It's to do with the level of funding that community transport has, and that then impacts on the services that they can deliver. Yeah.
Okay. And the final thing then is around accessibility. We hear more and more often that taxi providers who have fully accessible taxis are maybe no longer as many in existence as there should be, and there is a greater demand for those. I'm just wanting to get your flavour for how strong the community transport sector is in terms of supporting people who are in wheelchairs and have mobility issues, and is that something that we should be concerned about and doing more to promote?
As far as I'm aware, and maybe Leona or John might know more about the detail than I do, is that all of our community transport providers have fully accessible vehicles, so they can provide that service. They're not taxis; they are buses. So from an accessibility perspective, that should be compliant on this.
Yeah. Yep. I mean, all the vehicles in the community transport sector would be accessible. It is an issue that the community transport providers raise about the lack of accessible taxis, because they would on occasion use taxis to supplement their bus services if they need to transport one or two individuals rather than wasting a whole bus to take one person somewhere. They would prefer to then maybe hire a taxi to do that, but particularly in rural areas they have raised that there is an issue with the number of accessible taxis just in general in Northern Ireland, and those that are there are quite heavily utilised by other people. So it is something that we're aware of through the community transport sector, but taxi policy is outside of our branch, but
Yeah,
we're
no,
aware
appreciate
that I think the committee has had officials here talking about what they're doing on taxi licensing recently. So.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. Cahill?
Thanks, Sharon. Thank you very much for your presentation so far and your answers. Just obviously want to start by saying, obviously, unfortunately, rising from COVID, it's given us now a new opportunity to look right across the board on how things are delivered. You know what I mean? 'Cause there's been searching questions and answers arising from that, and I want to go on record and express my thanks to the Community Transport Association. You know, down my own way, what they deliver, they're covering those gaps. But I mean, tackling social isolation and all those things, I mean that's vitally important. But I think we have, and I know you're carrying out reviews, but I want to reference the State of the Sector report from CTA now, the 2025 one. They done one in 2010, but they've updated it. The early indications, the findings from it, because we should have a good understanding now right across the board of the needs on the work that right across the board everybody's doing. So we should have a full analysis of that. But my question is, in what they have said in their report and early indications going forward, what have we learned, or what's the new role going forward? And I appreciate the funding issue, because the funding issue is always going to be an issue for us. But we're going to have to tackle and address the need that's out there as best we can. And community transport's covering those gaps, to be honest with you. So going forward, learning from what your first part of your review, what evidence now you will gather in the second, but more importantly, their piece of work that they have done so far in the State of the Sector, going forward for them, where do you see them going forward? Or anything we've learned and what we can deliver going forward?
Maybe pass to Leon in a second.
I know it's a difficult one, folks, but I mean, it's just been
That's
around a long
what I was
time.
thinking.
Yeah.
I think I mentioned earlier on, I think one of the important things for us in the review for the phase 2 is to make sure we have that engagement with the community transport sector. And so as part of, we've set up a small board to sort of oversee the review. It's primarily officials here, but also we're bringing in somebody from Community Transport Association to sit on that board to oversee that work, to try and ensure that the direction of travel we're going in and our initial findings align with them, so they have an opportunity to input to it at an early stage. In addition to that, CTA being on the board, we will have engagement with the group and also the individual providers to ensure we capture that information. In terms of their annual report, and maybe pass to Leona and maybe make a comment on that.
Yeah, I suppose I should preface this by saying I've just joined the department quite recently, just before Christmas, to specifically come and work on this review. So I don't have a background in transport or community transport as such. So I am kind of actively learning and trying to pick up those lessons that you're talking about there, from what has come from the CTA report, what's come from our phase 1 report. And I suppose for me, the thing that stands out in terms of what I've learned from all of that good work that's been done by my predecessors is that we have a very clear understanding of the need for community transport and the potential for community transport in terms of what it could do. The thing that's still kind of missing for me is understanding what it costs to deliver it and what it might cost to deliver the other things we would like it to deliver, and the sort of the strategy around all that is sort of somewhat absent in terms of what's our vision for community transport, what do we actually want it to do. So those are the things I want to start to tease out now in phase 2, is understanding how much it will cost to do the things we want to do, so that we can build. We've got the robust need, we've got the value that it adds through the stuff that CTA is doing in terms of the social value metric that they're working on. So we've got those two pieces of the puzzle.
No, I appreciate it. And the point is, there's a very good report we can learn from there.
Yeah,
and we need it,
absolutely.
because we've been at this a long time, let's be honest. I mean, and to be fair, we want to get it right. There shouldn't be firefighting every year for funding. I agree with multi-year budgets and everything else everybody said, but I just want to reference that report because there's good information in it.
Yeah,
So my other 2 points, Chair, is because I could speak about this subject all day. The 10B permits, in terms of the impact it has, your discussions with CTA, their views on timeframes and all that. There, would you like to comment on that, please?
The issue of 10B permits seems to have been around for a long time. I think there is a piece of work ongoing within the department in terms of looking at the 10B permits, and I'm not too sure if the committee have had a briefing from officials on that. But part of the analysis from the Phase 1 report, the answer to that question, the 10B will be considered by a separate team. However, as part of the work that Leona and John are taking forward, they will be working closely with a team to understand any issues around 10B. What I would say though is the initial information that I've understood from the Phase 1 report is that the 10B licence isn't necessarily a major constraint on the delivery of services. Major constraint coming back to funding, unfortunately. But supposed to be assured, we will be looking at the 10B licences and they will factor that into our review in Phase 2.
So we're getting closer to the funding model. I know you're only in, but
Yeah.
we'll take it per se. You've said that today, so you're getting closer to it, because I mean, if it's down to funding and what they can do, because we know what the need is,
Yeah.
and then we develop a programme to deliver, then we know then what the funding model is. And just probably the last question in terms of learning from elsewhere, particularly maybe the 26, and any learnings from elsewhere across the board and across the islands that'll influence some of the conversations or some of the recommendations going forward.
At this stage, unless we will be looking across the board, whether it's on other parts of this island, whether it's across the water or whether it's in other parts of the world, we will be looking at how our community transport services are delivered elsewhere as part of our consideration. I'm not too sure, Leona, if there's anything more you want to add?
The Phase 1 team did do quite a lot of review of the literature around what other jurisdictions do, and there is quite a volume of information for John and I to draw on there in respect to that will feed into that service model delivery piece and the funding piece that maybe didn't make it into the final Phase 1 report, but we'll certainly be picking up on that as well and trying to learn from what other people are doing. If there's a better way that somebody else is doing it, we'll try and feed that back into how it would work in our jurisdiction.
And just finally, Chair, the issue obviously CTA is taking responsibility right across the board. The Chair mentioned the likes of the health sector and everything else. Where are we in terms of having conversations with other departments in terms of who's funding, who's not, or I know it's a difficult one because we've said this, but if we're going to crack this and we accept that CTA is going to fill those gaps and address those issues, we need to then talk across the departments how that funding model is going to be developed. So you'd like to comment on that? Maybe you can't comment for other departments, but we'll have to have a serious conversation about it.
It is a very valid point, but it's also very, very challenging, and it's back to, so as part of the cross-departmental working group, we've been working with colleagues in health to try and understand their needs and where they envisage potentially community transport trying to help provide some of those services, and then that could then be fed back into the review. But I'm going back to the work done back in 2013 to 2018 and that very noble idea of trying to integrate health, education, public transport, community transport, and the challenges that arose from that. So it's trying to then go, well, haven't had that challenges and the outcome of not being able to progress that as we envisaged, we're going back to let's try and, I'll use the word, deal with community transport in as it is, and rather than trying to do too much too soon. I think we have a better chance of focusing our efforts on individual areas that we can help improve that, and if we can get community transport into a better place than it is today, and I think we'd all welcome that there. So I suppose that's our focus, rather than trying to do too much as previously. Try and focus in on individual areas and take it piece by piece, if that makes sense.
As long as you keep reference their map, that report they've done, I mean, a lot of it's in it, you know what I mean? Okay. Thank you very much, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I think we've all acknowledged what a important role the whole community transport plays. So the fact that we're looking at it and trying to stabilise it and develop it's really good. Just coming back, sorry, just to Mr. Boylan's point there about it, does the department see the connection between the funding model and the 10B and the licensing? Because just on account of how the licenses work now, that it is quite a financial undertaking for community transport? Is that something that you've looked at?
I'm going to pass to Leona on that one.
There's not the 10B license. I don't think it's specifically that expensive to have the 10B license. To have a full bus operator license costs a lot more. But you know, the relationship between the licensing and how these organisations operate and what cost that comes to bear on their bottom line is something that we'll definitely be looking at as part of the financial and performance review to help us fully understand what the costs are to these organisations and understand where perhaps there are opportunities for government to ease financial burden that we're essentially putting on them through, you know, a licensing scheme or whatever else that might be. You know, so those are aspects of the current operation environment that they work within that we'll hope to tease out as part of the review.
Okay, and then again, sort of sticking on practical matters as well. Again, in conversation with community transport, is it being looked at as well? Just, you know, the constraints around sometimes the council boundaries that the community transport has to sort of, they can't necessarily travel between them. But again, that's a big constraint. Is the review looking at that?
That's one of the things, yeah, we look at as well, is the operational areas and the operational model or the rules of the scheme that they operate under, you know, and then that, you know, once you get to the edge of your boundary, that's sort of you and you stop. So there is a consciousness between ourselves and the department and the organisations that perhaps people in those boundary areas are missing out somewhat because, you know, if you live in Toome, for example, you're part of the area that is based in Ballyclare and they can take you to Antrim or Ballyclare, but you probably want to go to Macrofelt if you live in Toome because that's closer, but they can't take you there, so you have to be in part of that organisation. So looking at the membership of the scheme and whether you can choose to be, you know, within one area or another, you know, depending on sort of your geography, that is something that we'll hope to kind of investigate and make recommendations on.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Mark?
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the team for coming along. I don't think anyone could accuse us of doing too much too soon. Right enough, as you'd outlined, community transport services grew to address a gap not being met by existing public and private markets. And you said the model had largely unchanged since 2013, but how has the level of funding sort of fluctuated in that time? And like John rightly identified struggles that the community transport sector had where now some of those gaps that they had plugged will have reappeared, but even contraction in the public transport market will have meant that there's gaps there now that were never there before. Do you know, has there been much of an assessment of that?
I do have the report in front of me, but I can't find the figures just here. I think in the Phase 1 report, I think that did look at the historic funding to the community transport providers. And I think historically, for the last number of years, which would have been distorted because of COVID, there had been a reduction in funding from several years ago. I doubt to have the percentages in front of me. There's no doubt then there are financial pressures across the sector, and as I mentioned earlier, in last 24-25 financial year, Minister O'Dowd was able to increase the funding for community transport in year to alleviate some of those pressures. But I think the trend had been that funding had been reduced from several years ago to where we are today. And I think that reflects the constrained financial environment of the public sector as a whole and the department as a whole.
Yeah, and that increase was from an already reduced opening baseline. Do you know, so it was still less funding than it had been previously. It just wasn't as big of a cut. Now, the cross-departmental working group, extremely important to see it was established in 2023. I think I recall one, maybe it hadn't got the same name, being set up when Danny Kennedy was Minister for Regional Development. Now, obviously, the work of that group is extremely important. It's important that we break down the silos that clearly do exist between and even within some departments, and get them to recognise that, like, our issue seems to be the cost of public transport, or the department's problem they're battling with, but for others to realise the value of it to them as well. But you said the group hadn't met in quite a while. Could you just when the last meeting of it was?
Good comment.
It may have been October or November, I think, and then I think it had been due to meet in January, but it had been put off for until today, I think it is now.
Sorry, is that October 2024?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think so, yeah.
No, that's. I'm relieved. It's not great, but it's better than it was fearing. I was fearing that it hadn't met maybe since that inaugural meeting in 2023, and I know there had been issues there with a lack of an assembly, a lack of ministerial direction, but we can't afford to have what appears to be a lack of urgency now as well around this issue. And I'm not leveling that at any of the officials here today, but it is clearly an issue that exercises us as committee members, because we see the benefits of these schemes, and we know the effect of a reduction in these schemes on our constituents. Andrew, I'm glad he touched on the cross-boundary issues. I was going to ask about that. But there was another issue, and it might predate some of you there. 3 years ago, there was a grant given to, or funding awarded. We often talk about decarbonisation and the role of public transport in it. We have to get more people on buses, and that'll apply to community transport too. But community transport organisations were given in total funding of £1.3 million to purchase electric vehicles. Now, it's my understanding I was able to drag this out maybe in 2023, that 6 of them had managed, 13 operators benefited from this funding. 6 of them were able to acquire vehicles, but I think there were another 7 who had paid for vehicles that they never got due to the manufacturer going into administration. Now, I wonder, has the department or the sector been able to recoup any of that money, which I don't know the exact calculation, but if you divide 1.3 by 13 and assume that they get 100 grand each, or is that £700,000 of the department and that the sector should have got, and the people that benefited from, has that just evaporated?
I'll maybe bring John in a second, give him a chance to think about it. My understanding is that 1.3 million was allocated from the department to the community transport providers, and therefore it did go to the sector. The fact then that manufacturer went into administration, I think that money then was lost, and it could be up to those individual providers to then try and seek recompense through whatever the administration was, but I suspect that money has been lost.
Yeah, that's pretty much it in summary. Yeah, I don't think the administration process is exactly finished yet, but I don't think I think it's probably unlikely that it's, unsecured creditors or whatever will be able to recoup that.
And these per community transport providers are probably well down the pecking order. I wonder, maybe it's too late now. Would the department, or could the department have had a role in supporting them in that? It is public money that just gone down the drain, essentially. I think it's scandalous. It's not the fault of the department either. But no, thank you for coming in, like I say, and it's important that, I suppose, more urgency is applied to getting this work done, and more funding is applied and sort of directed towards the sector as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Keith?
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Leona, Peter and John, for coming in. I have a couple of questions following on from Cathal and Mark's a little bit. The departmental working group you talked about, which is meeting today, what's their objectives?
It's really to engage with DAERA and health to understand their needs and where community transport can help deliver some of their objectives by community transport. So trying to explore where are the options that community transport can help them in the delivery of their services.
So if I go to any meeting, I want a goal at the end of that meeting. I'm not meeting people just for the fun, I want an objective or to score a goal. So what's the goal you want to score out of those departmental meetings, as in DFI?
Well, at the minute, it's trying to explore with our colleagues in those other departments where there are opportunities. So if we're able to identify those potential opportunities, then the goal, as you put it, is to see, well, actually, how can we do that there? How can community transport deliver some or all of those services that could be provided? And then you're into what would be the service delivery model for that there? How would you fund it? But the initial ask really is to try and understand the scope of where community transport can help support them.
That departmental working group, this meeting, when will we know it's been successful? And are we going to get a report to say, we've had our meetings over the past number of years and we recommend we do A, B and C?
We can do at the committee.
But will we, Peter?
Well, I suppose it's up to the ask of the committee. If the committee are seeking.
Sorry, Mark. Mark, your mic's still on. Thank you. Sorry
You don't
for
have to answer
interrupting.
Mark's question.
Outside of my remit, I think. But I suppose the committee are fully entitled to seek an update on the outworkings of that working group. We can take an action, Chair, if you wanted to, for us to come back 6 months, 12 months with an update on, if you would say 6 months, I don't, because I heard the word urgency mentioned several times. We can come back within 6 months with an update on how that has progressed and what the goals and objectives have been and whether or not we've actually achieved them.
Okay. That'll be good, and we can probably touch on that after. The Chair touched on the healthcare piece and the transport that CTA and all the partners does. There's talk that it's 40% approximately. Some of those guys will tell you we're doing 40% healthcare work, right? So is your department going to claw back 40% from the Health Minister?
At this minute in time, no. So we're providing that funding for the community transport providers to provide a range of services, some of which includes enabling their members to access health facilities. For other members, it's accessing shopping, others it's for accessing other services. So we're providing the funding as a department for them to provide those services. There's no mechanism for us to claw back that money from any other department. One of the things, being back to that cross-departmental working group, if there are opportunities for community transport to better or more formally help deliver some of their services, then you're into, well, what would the mechanism be of that be in terms of service delivery and then also funding? So who would pay for it?
So I asked a question of the Northern Trust for the year 23-24. Total cost of Northern Trust. So the total expenditure on transport not provided by Trust in-house services in 23-24 is 2.355 million. Now bear in mind that's taxis on private ambulances, and appreciate a private ambulance is different than a community transport. So there's 2.355 million in the Northern Trust alone to taxis, okay? So there's bound to be, I obviously represent Magherafelt Cookstown here, there's people now, the Trust is paying for taxis to drive into Cookstown to lift somebody in health and drive to Dundrum. So we have to be using that cleverly, that we can stop in Magherafelt or whatever. And appreciate, you talked about somebody living in Toome would go to Ballyclare, and appreciate all that. But there has to be savings there, and I can't understand why it took so long for the Trust to not work out. There's a bus sitting in Magherafelt empty, and we're paying a taxi to drive from Cookstown past it. Why does it take a departmental working group meeting for years to not work that out, that that's cheaper? And I'm making it very simplistic, and I appreciate that it's not as simple as a 2.35 million jumping straight across. Has to be savings.
Yeah. No, I think I understand where you're coming from, and I suppose that maybe hits to the core of the previous review back in 2013 to 2018, where I think as a community we recognise you've got different providers providing different levels of services in the public transport sector, whether it's ourselves, whether it's education, whether it's a private sector, whether it's health. And is there not a mechanism of trying to bring that together in a more integrated fashion? And I think that's a very noble goal, and I think we would all sign up to it. However, when we went through that work, we did the pilot in the Dungannon area. It looked at a number of areas, including how community transport could provide more dedicated services for health. But in trying to turn that noble idea into a pilot, identified opportunities, but then trying to turn it into real tangible. How do you roll that out across the whole department, or sorry, the whole region? Becomes very, very challenging, because you've got different objectives across different departments and different stakeholders. You've got different legislation for those organisations. You have different pay and conditions for those operators. So it becomes very, very challenging, and that was one of the main reasons why that pilot didn't translate into a new integrated service that we're sitting in today. So it's still a very noble objective, but the practicality of getting from where we are today to that has been very challenging. And back to what I was saying earlier on, that assessment of the project really made a recommendation of, rather than trying to do all of that at once, come back and have a look and try and do it in individual in different individual projects. And that's was the approach when I came around to try and do that there. I fully accept as an ultimate goal, having a fully integrated service would be much better, but we are where we are, and we're trying to do it in a sort of a piecemeal approach.
Okay, and final question, Chair. Leonie, you talked a couple of times there about to try and work out exact costs of what it costs. Are you going to drill into that? Are you looking at that from a broad Northern Ireland CTA point of view? Are you looking at that per area, per provider within that? Because some provider may be more efficient than other providers within the CTA. So are you going to look at that per area or broadly a cost? And I appreciate you can have rural areas and you can have urban areas which more or less cost effective.
Yeah, we'll be looking at each area individually, because one of the things that you may have noticed in the Phase 1 report, it has a breakdown of cost per trip for each of the providers. But what we don't really understand behind that is, we've taken figures from that report from their annual accounts and what their expenditure is, but we don't understand what they're putting into that expenditure line, so we don't understand if we're comparing like with like, or where we're comparing apples and oranges. So we will be going to each provider and trying to understand the actual expenditure that they've had in a year, and make sure that everybody's apportioning their costs the same way, make sure that they're including everything they should be including and not including things they shouldn't be including, so that we have an accurate, or as accurate as possible, a figure for each individual provider. And then at that point, we can take into account factors that vary between one area and another, that would account for somebody having a higher cost than somebody else. If you've got a more dispersed urban or rural area.
All apples should be the same and the oranges should be the same.
Yeah. As once you've allowed for reasonable differences, but we'll be looking at an overall cost for the whole of Northern Ireland as well, and just as part of summarising up that information. But
thank you, appreciate that.
Thank you. Cathal, you were looking in on the
just
point.
on that point, because Keith raised a good point, but surely, Leona, what we're aiming for is, and even if it's multi-year budgets, that CTA should have a business plan for their delivery every year. And that's what we're aiming at. Now, I do agree with trying to save funds. I don't know, Peter, the issue is very complicated right across the board in terms of different departments. But what we need to get to is CTA come with a business plan or a development plan, whatever you like to call it, and this is what we're going to deliver, plus or minus in between, whatever. There may be other duties or whatever. That's what we need to get at. Are we close to getting that?
I mean, we do have something like that at the minute, and John can keep me right here if I'm wrong, but each year each of the providers has to put forward a business case to the department to bid for the grant funding that they're getting from us. So we do have that business case model. What we don't have is maybe the drill down of detail behind some of that, to really understand what's behind the costs and what's behind the differences between one operator and another, between one scheme and another in terms of the DIAL and the DAT scheme. So it's a journey we're on there, to keep the metaphors contextual.
No, a journey on stronger conversations right across the departments.
We're trying to move that on to have a better understanding of all of those costs, so that we can make better decisions on the basis of it.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I just want to come back to a few things. Obviously, during the course of the conversation, I've heard it say, it's very noble to have an integrated public transport, but it's very challenging. And to me, that just points to me that it's too difficult to do, so we're not going to do it. which I think is really quite shameful whenever we're trying to get people on to public transport. We're trying to reduce reliance on cars. This is a fundamental problem in rural areas. I represent a rural area. There is no bus transport links in some of the towns that I represent, and community transport could play a real vital role in relation to that. So what are the challenges that you think make it insurmountable for this to be progressed further?
Well, I think, Chair, if we're looking at the review of community transport, what we're looking at is to see how can that community transport sector deliver those services you allude to more effectively, more efficiently, and providing potentially more of those with this, for a funding model across the region. So that would all include your constituencies. So that's the intention of the review, to see how we can try and do that.
In the context of TransLink as well, and how TransLink can play a partnership role with community transport?
Well, the TransLink will be delivering the services as we've set out within the PSA. Our review in the community transport will look to see how community transport can supplement those services. As I mentioned earlier, the services delivered by TransLink, we've set them out in the PSA. They may change over time to reflect the outworkings of the various transport plans and what the future service delivery might be. But our focus in terms of the community transport review is on the community transport sector and how they can deliver their services in their own area.
Well, I'm saying very fundamentally from my position where I sit, I don't see rural public transport expansion. I don't see that, and something needs to happen. And we've talked about the urgency here in this committee today, and I think it's important that the rural area and its needs are taken into consideration as part of that very fundamentally. Also, we talked about the price per cost of trip and the review obviously of funding in phase 2. There also needs to be a wee bit of degree of fluidity built in too, because we're looking at a sector where you have insurance costs, you have the likes of maintenance of vehicles. Mark touched on the EV side of things as well. So is that fluidity going to be built in, particularly in the context where we will be moving to that multi-year budget type cycle, as the Finance Minister indicated in the Chamber this week?
Yes, please.
Absolutely, yes. And one of the other things as well that I suppose relates to that we want to do is identify opportunities where we can, as a department, help those organisations realise economies of scale on some of those costs that you're mentioning there, maintenance and things like that. You know, there's opportunity there for us to work with those providers to help them through government procurement, that we can put in place contracts for them for maintenance, or potentially leverage the resources that are already existing within government through TransLink or wherever, to allow them access to cheaper maintenance, cheaper fuel, things like that. We hope to identify some of those opportunities by being able to dig into their costs and seeing where a lot of their money's going, and seeing are there ways to help them save money. You know, if we can't get them more money through grant funding, we can certainly try and help them spend less money on things that that we can collectively buy for them, and that allows more money then to go towards the services rather than the overhead. So those are things we want to look at.
So you're seeing inefficiencies in the system, and what inefficiencies do you think that there are at this moment in time?
Well, I don't know at this point in time because we haven't looked into them, but I anticipate that there will be things like that, and that's kind of what we're going looking for. So you don't know until you turn over the stone what's under the rock, but there'll be something there. You know, there'll be. I wouldn't doubt that there'll be opportunities to find ways to help these organisations as a department.
Yeah, if I could clarify, Chair. So we're not saying at this stage, and we haven't done the analysis, that there are inefficiencies, but we recognise that there are potential for delivering more efficiencies through the use of other means, whether it be through central procurement, or through the use of maybe potentially TransLink and helping them in terms of maintenance and or fuel. So we're not saying there's inefficiencies, we're saying there's potential to drive better efficiency through the use of other resources. But say that's us going into review with our eyes opened and identifying those at an early stage.
And then lastly, just in terms of a question for myself, obviously we're looking at the funding of community transport associations, looking at the funding models. Has there been any assessment done in relation to if we, as the Deputy Chair pointed out, you know, a lot of the community associations are in a very precarious situation. Has there been any analysis done of what the cost would be if we didn't have community transport in place here in Northern Ireland? Particularly through that cross-departmental working group.
I'm not aware of anybody's asked the question, if there's no community transport, what would the outcome be? In financial terms, we wouldn't be spending the 5.4 million, but in terms of service delivery, obviously there would be a significant impact on the members of those groups and the services that are provided, and that wouldn't be a financial impact, could be a financial impact for those individuals, because they might have to find other means of accessing transport, or indeed they may not be able to access transport at all. Is that okay?
Well,
No, well, I was just agreeing with Peter.
Okay,
There.
sorry.
We haven't you know, nobody. I have not come across in my research any analysis of, you know, what would happen if CT disappeared overnight and it wasn't there. But I suspect the impact would be, you know, in that the social impact in terms of how it affects individuals, and also the work that CTA are doing at the minute on the social value indices. They're kind of doing some work to draw out what community transport contributes to the economy in terms of, like, for how many trips you've done, it puts this much money into the local economy. So when they develop that more fully, there'd be a way maybe of assessing that to say, well, if that wasn't there, that's how much you would lose to your local economy in terms of money, but also in terms of social value as well.
And just to be clear, Chair, the review is into how we deliver community transport services going forward, not the intention of removing community transport. And it was just a question, just wanted to be clear.
yeah, no, I think it's a fundamental, you know, looking at what the cost would be, because there will be a lot of socio-economic impacts as a result of that. I mean, health, just one example where there will be people who will not be able to meet their hospital appointments, you know, and the knock-on impact that has is pretty huge. Mark, you were looking in just, and then we'll come to the end.
Thank you, Chair. It was just to make that question of yours, Chair, maybe just a wee bit less hypothetical, and maybe a wee bit easier to answer or to get the information for. Now, John, when he was speaking earlier, referred to situations and places where providers had fallen by the wayside, if you like, or had to withdraw services. So we it might be easier to actually focus there and see what the costs were, rather than what the costs might be should things go away. Look where it has happened and what the cost has been by speaking to former service users and then the providers of other services like health and so forth as well.
Okay, maybe that's something that could be taken back.
Yeah, that, I mean, it's something we can potentially weave into phase 2 of our report, you know, based on data that we already have, doing that kind of analysis on it to, you know, to put in some of that narrative around the impact of not having services, or the impact of cuts to services, what that is.
Okay, well, that would be useful, and it would be good to see that, if that's something that can be weaved into the phase 2. And we look forward to seeing that come October time.
To clarify, the team is John and me, so there's 2 of us working on this. So
yes.
Just on your point, because I mean, you keep mentioning the health stuff, and if we're not having a serious conversation, if we are talking about DFI funding model without having proper discussion with other departments and other responsibilities that lay outside the DFI, well then it's the wrong starting point. And I know there's a group set up. So we need to have a serious conversation about that. Because the point then is we need to raise the funding out of the DFI to deliver the model that's presented to you. So the chair kept mentioning about they're covering these, GP services, all the services people need to visit there, all the health sector right across the board. And that has to be a challenge for DFI budgets. So let's have a proper conversation. That's all I'm saying.
That will be picked up as part of that cross-departmental working group.
Okay, so thank you for your time and coming to the committee today. Obviously there was two I think fundamental points for yourselves to follow up on. It was the regional transport strategy in terms of the inclusion of community transport and that, and the engagement that there has been between community transport and DFI in relation to that. And then the other thing was you'd said about the cross-departmental working group and that potentially you come back to the committee on a 6-monthly biannual type period of time to report back to us. So it would be really, really good if we could see that, not just a stock report back to the committee, but if we could have contained within that what key themes were discussed during those cross-departmental working groups, and obviously the solutions or achievements that have come out of those working groups. If you could report back to the committee on that, that would be great. Keith, you were looking at
just who's leading on that? Who leads that departmental working group?
Us DFI,
Okay.
our lead department.
Fair enough.
if that would be super, if that would be great. And then obviously I think that the next report then to the committee would be around that October time, so that should tee in nicely if all goes to plan. So that would be great if you could do that.
We'll plan on that basis.
Super, that's perfect. Luke, thank you very much for your time, much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, committee.
Okay, members, thank you for your questions on that, because obviously, as we've said there, it is very important for our local constituencies. Was there anything that people wanted to pick up on, Keith?
Mark touched on it there, and he built into the point about when they met. It'd be good to get an understand every date they met, get a copy of each minute of each meeting, and know what their terms of reference or objectives are.
Yeah.
Because there's no point having meetings for the sake of meetings.
Yeah.
So many times they've met under whatever name, every date, and a copy of minutes, on their objectives or terms of reference, and then obviously we're going to get an update of where they're at. But I think those minutes will tell us something if we get them.
Yeah. Okay.
Another one, Chair, was I tried to get to it, and I'm conscious I haven't got all the detail today, but I'd like to know where organisations have fallen by the wayside and where the pressures are. I know it's subjective, but where they think the pressures are most being realised, and also then where the gaps are, where organisations haven't popped up when others have fallen by the wayside. I think that would be really useful to know. It doesn't need to be part of the report. There should be a catalogue and a system, I would imagine, of cataloguing and keeping an eye on these groups.
Yeah. We'll follow up with them on that just to check. Anything else? Obviously, we'll be keeping a watchful eye for October to see what happens in terms of the phase 2. Mark?
Right, sorry, Chair. I know we're going to look for that stuff on the working group, but also they weren't able to furnish us, the officials, with the details of, I suppose, the trajectory or the levels of funding over, say, the last decade. So what it has been year on year.
Yeah. So from about 2013, Mark?
Yeah. If we get opening and closing sort of budgets for each year as well.
Okay. That's grand. You can do that. Okay, content to move on then? Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So item 8 is Department for Infrastructure contribution to the programme for government. This is written evidence. At page 198, you'll see Department for Infrastructure contribution to the programme for government cover letter. At page 200, you'll see Department for Infrastructure contribution to the programme for government written evidence. So are there any particular areas that you would like to seek further detail on or to schedule oral evidence on? Use content. So I
Sorry,
was,
Chair.
yeah,
I
sorry, Mark.
wonder, could we just schedule sorry, I couldn't open the thing here, but could we just ask for oral evidence on the thing in its entirety
Okay,
rather than specific elements of it?
okay. Who's content with that?
I think that would be beneficial, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Happy enough. And then, so in the Finance Minister's written statement last week, it stated that there was combined with the draft budget allocation. That I'm quoting this brings funding provided specifically for PFG priorities to some 425 million. And I was thinking maybe that we write to the Finance Minister to seek a disaggregation of the 425 million by department to obviously inform our oversight of the delivery of programme for government priorities in relation to infrastructure elements as well. Are you content with that? Yeah.
Sure. Yep.
Okay, so then I think everybody's in agreement that we then get schedule an oral evidence session just in relation to the entirety of the programme for government priorities. Okay. Thank you. Item 9 is subordinate legislation. SR is not subject to assembly procedure. Advise members that there are 2 statutory rules that are not subject to assembly proceedings and are not required to be laid. These are at pages 217 to 226 of the meeting pack and are the SR 2025-71, the road races Cookstown 100 motorcycle road race order Northern Ireland 2025 and SR 2025-72, the road races Craigantlet hill climb order Northern Ireland 2025. I remind members that the committee noted the proposal for the statutory rules at its meeting on the 26th of March 2025. So I'm asking members if you're content to note the statutory rules. Yeah. Thank you. Item 10 is subordinate legislation. SL1 is not subject to assembly procedure. So advise members that there are 4 proposals for statutory rules that are not subject to assembly proceedings and are not required to be laid. These can be found from pages 228 to 239 of the meeting pack and are the SL1, the Parking Places Disabled Persons Vehicles Amendment number 2, Order Northern Ireland 2025. SL1, the road races Maiden City Stages Rally, Order Northern Ireland 2025. The SL1, the road races Northern Ireland 200, Order Northern Ireland 2025. And the SL1, Parking Places on Roads Diplomatic Vehicles, Order Northern Ireland 2025. So has any members any issues that they wish to raise in the proposals? No. So I'm just asking that you're content with the proposals for the statutory rules. Okay, thank you, members. We have got to the Forward Work Programme at page 241. You'll see the draft Forward Work Programme. Do you want to provide an update just in relation to what will be coming after Easter?
Yes, Chair. The work programme is sort of getting quite well populated post-Easter. The department was recently consulting on the review of trust sports. So we're hoping to get a oral evidence from officials at some point there. But to sort of coincide with that, the Belfast Harbour Commissioners, when the committee resumed business last year, wrote to the committee inviting it to come down and do a visit of the port. So we thought it might be an opportune time to perhaps combine that and receiving evidence on proposals that might be coming forward by the department. So we've actually been engaging informally with the Harbour Commissioners, and they could, if members were in agreement, that we could arrange for an external committee meeting on the 28th of May. So it's really just to give as much sort of notice for members, and that would be to sort of inform any pre-legislative scrutiny of the bill that was potentially coming. So, as I say, it's entirely a matter for the committee if they'd minded to, but there'd be an opportunity to hear from the commissioners about what any legislative proposals, and also potentially from the department on the outcome of that consultation. So, as I said, they were hoping to try and make a few arrangements with a few extra things like a tour of the lock and things. But as I said, it's really if members are content on that basis, or if not, really.
Members, would you be content with that? Because obviously it'll coincide with our deliberations on the ports bill.
I'm content, sure, sadly I'm not here that day.
Oh, you'll miss a wee
I'll be in a
trip out.
forest. But don't
You'll be firmly on land then.
Oh, you're going to miss all the surfing and all, skateboard and all that.
Isn't there a building in it?
So
kayak
I take it we're in agreement then to
Yeah,
go ahead
yeah.
and schedule that outside visit to Belfast Harbour then. Yeah.
And then we were due to have the Ulster Anglers Federation on the 30th of April with regards to the reservoirs proposed subordinate legislation, and then the Community Transport Association on the 21st of May. So as I said, there's the work programme from sort of Easter onwards is filling up quite nicely. So
Okay.
and then obviously we're still anticipating the bill from the department prior to the summer, so that will keep the
Dictate
committee
things
busy.
as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, content with that.
Just finally then, the raised briefing on the examples of alternative models for funding for water and sewage operators. I know the committee had expressed an interest in looking wider than these jurisdictions, so looking to see any best practice elsewhere. So that will be rescheduled for the 7th of May, just to allow a bit more time to look at what other models are out there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, members. And then I suppose just to say, obviously we're going into our recess period now. So in terms of the packs, that will be out on Monday the 28th of April, just obviously because of the recess and when we come back. So you're content with that?
Keith was telling me he likes the bit in the red writing, Chair. On the programme, he loves the bit in the red writing.
You bet, sir.
Absolutely,
Wait
two
till
bits.
the
There's two
cameras
bits.
goes off,
You
we'll
never mentioned the second bit in the red writing. Okay.
Yes, I think most of us enjoy that. Okay, so just seeking agreement that we proceed with the evidence sessions as set out in the draft forward work programme and to reflect any decisions taken today. Agreed. Look, members, thank you very much. Just on the back of that, we had quite a mammoth session there between December and Easter. So thanks for your cooperation with me as chair in getting through some of that business. Item 12 is any other business. So do any members have any other business that they want to raise? No? Okay. Okay, thank you everybody. The date, time and location of the next meeting will be the 30th of April at 10 a.m. here in room 29 Parliament Buildings. I now adjourn the meeting and happy Easter everyone.
You too.
Committee Room 29. Sound.